Last week, here at I Dream of Retro Games, we released a video about 5 NES games that were based on R-rated movies. Part of that list had a little bit of a bonus entry in the fact that there was an unreleased NES version of RoboCop vs. Terminator. I had so much fun with the fact that I found that it got me thinking. RoboCop vs. Terminator actually started off as a comic book series. What other unreleased games are out there based on comics? So here we are, 5 video games based on comic books that never officially got released, presented here in chronological order. First up on the list is Swamp Thing, which should have been released in 1991 for the Sega Genesis. Swamp Thing is a character from DC Comics which first appeared in House of Secrets number 92, published in July of 1971. This initial appearance was actually a standalone story that was not a part of the regular DC continuity and even took place in an earlier time period. But the character proved popular and they later added him to the DC universe. While there have been variations on the character over the years, generally speaking, you're looking at a scientist who was once human who becomes a plant-like creature due to an accident. He fights to protect the swamp and the environment in general, and takes on people who will go against that. There have been multiple movies and TV shows for Swamp Thing over the years, as well as an NES game that came out in 1992. But with that said, this Genesis game would have predated that. Swamp Thing on Genesis was developed by Microsmiths, a development company founded in Ipswich, Mass. On August 1st, 1984. It was founded by former Parker Brothers and Activision programmers. They developed the Sega Master System port of King's Quest: Quest for the Crown in 1989, as well as 2 Sega Genesis titles, Bimini Run in 1991, and Jack Nicklaus's Power Challenge Golf in 1993, which ultimately would be their final game. Publishing for Swamp Thing would have been done by New Vision Entertainment, a short-lived American publisher for the Sega Genesis. I just say Sega Genesis and not Mega Drive because, as I mentioned, they were American, so I'm going to be very American about this. And I believe we just celebrated the 4th of July, so I'm going to win this argument this time. For the record, I've said this before, I think the Mega Drive is a cooler name, but, you know, old habits die hard. New Vision was founded in Westport, Connecticut on July 25th, 1990, also by former Parker Brothers employees, and the only work that they actually published was the previously mentioned Bimini Run. All their other work were unreleased games, including this Swamp Thing game. Officially on October 1st, 1993, they were defunct. For those wondering what the actual gameplay of Swamp Thing was to be, essentially you would move left and right while punching and transforming into various other items to help you get through the swamp. There's going to be other creatures trying to take you out, and you have to figure out what's the best way to get through without dying yourself. For me personally, I found that the best way to do this was to just click demo on the main screen so that you could see the game played by the programmers themselves, as it just didn't play well. It was very stiff and hard to control, and sometimes I wasn't quite sure what to do, and it wasn't that great of a game, so I think they made the right choice in not publishing it. It's hard to say if the graphics would have improved had the game finished more development, but as they stand right now, they are rather generic for a lot of the characters. There's not a ton of detail, but Swamp Thing himself does look decent, although the sprites are pretty small. The sound effects are your typical Genesis fare, and while the song is decent at best, there is only one, and it just loops over and over again. As you will typically see with leaked versions of unreleased games, there are definitely issues while playing it, including the fact that the game will lock up after you finish the first level. So again, thankfully there is the option for it to do a pre-recorded demo to kind of show off what the game is to be, but really this is for die-hard Swamp Thing fans only. And from 1991, we move forward in time to now it's late 1994, where we almost had a Prime game for the Super Nintendo. Who's Prime, you ask? Yeah, I don't blame you. Prime was a superhero from Malibu Comics under their Ultraverse imprint. My friends and I growing up were huge comic book fans, and you know who read Prime? No one. The only other thing that I can think of that even Malibu had going for it was Men in Black, and I don't even know anybody that read that before the movie came out. Prime was their flagship character though, and the leader of Ultra Force, which I guess you could think of as kind of like their Justice League or Avengers. Malibu started in 1986, and they actually were initially behind the publishing of Image from 1992 to 1993. At that point, Image grew to be so much bigger that they didn't need the help of Malibu anymore. And unfortunately for Malibu, come November 3rd, 1994, Marvel bought them. The character of Prime himself, though, debuted in Prime #1 in June of 1993, and the character is a 13-year-old boy named Kevin Green. He has the power to transform into the physical form of a superpowered adult, but he still keeps his adolescent mind in the meantime. So something very similar to Captain Marvel / Shazam, but different enough that they felt like that they were doing something unique. Part of Malibu's growth during the boom of comics in the early 90s was also the boom of video games, so they felt like that they should form Malibu Interactive, which was formed in late 1992. They did develop a Genesis game for their line of comics known as the X Mutants, that's EX, so it's, totally different. But that game came out in 1992 on the Genesis. But they also developed other games that were based on things other than their comics, like Batman Returns on the Genesis and Sega CD, Cliffhanger on Super Nintendo Genesis and Sega CD, and Three Ninjas Kick Back. Those last two games that I mentioned, Cliffhanger and Three Ninjas Kick Back, were both published by Sony ImageSoft, and it looked like that partnership would have continued for the publishing duties of Prime. Now, while Prime was being developed for the Super Nintendo, it did eventually get canceled, and we're not totally sure why, but there is speculation that it was because of the purchase by Marvel. Part of that purchase was shutting down the video game company, and eventually the game was ported to the Sega CD as a pack-in with a previously released game, Microcosm. Not much was done to change the Sega CD version, as it does look pretty much the same, and there's a bit of tweaks to the gameplay, but I haven't talked about that yet, so it's really not going to mean much to you, is it? The Sega CD version also added reading digital comics as well as some video interviews, so now you get those bonuses in super grainy video and totally unreadable fonts. So whether you've played the Sega CD version that was actually released or you're playing the leaked prototype for the Super Nintendo, you're getting an ultra generic brawler. I guess since the character himself was super generic, why not do that in video game form? Yes, you can jump, punch, and kick, just like every other beat-em-up out there. There is nothing that makes Prime stand out other than the fact that you're playing as a character that maybe you care about. Yes, there are combos to speak of, but they don't work as consistently as you'd like them to, and they're not really all that impressive. Just a few hits here and there, and if you hit forward while pressing the kick button on the Super Nintendo version, for whatever reason that causes you to just fly forward, which ends any type of combo you were trying to do otherwise. Also inconsistent while playing Prime is the way that you throw enemies. Sometimes I could do it over and over again, no problem, and other times I couldn't do it to save my life. It's just not really all that intuitive to do, and it just seems like it's just poor programming. Thankfully, something that was fixed in the Sega CD version is the fact that the levels just slog on the Super Nintendo. Enemies take way too many hits to kill. People like to complain about bullet sponges in games. I guess this would be, knuckle sponges? You could just punch them over and over again, and sometimes their health doesn't even look like it's going down. It looks like that 2-player was going to be an option as it is in the main menu, but whether you select 1 or 2 players, you're still only going to play it single player on Super Nintendo with the leaked prototype. As when talking about any other game that is incomplete, you're going to find things that are missing, and in the case of Prime, that would be the sound department. There are sound effects sometimes, but for the most part there isn't, and there's no music to speak of whatsoever. Sega CD did get some sweet Red Book audio though. Moving forward yet again, third on our list is Lobo, which should have been released in 1996 for both the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. Lobo is yet another DC character that was created by Roger Slipher and Keith Giffen. He first appeared in Omega Men #3, published in June of 1983. Lobo is an alien from the utopian planet Zarnia and works as an interstellar mercenary and bounty hunter. But of course, that's the retconned version, as his first appearance he was a totally different character. Due to be released in the winter of 1996, it obviously was cancelled and never came out, but there was also a tech demo released in the same year for Nintendo 64, and it's unknown if they started work or if it was just an idea that never materialized. Lobo on Super Nintendo was to be developed by High Performance Games, but on the Sega Genesis / Mega Drive, it was good old Ocean of America Incorporated. Yes, that's right. This was a game that was going to be published by Ocean Software. Ocean Software is a company that has been coming up quite a bit in my list videos lately, so I don't want to repeat myself and sound like a broken record. But if you haven't watched those videos, besides the fact that I'd like for you to go back and do so, I'll just quickly say that they were a company that put out lots of games at a high rate, and they were of questionable quality and usually of the licensed variety. So what you get with Lobo on the Super Nintendo and Genesis is a one-on-one fighting game, as those were what were popular at the time. You have the massive roster of 6 whole characters to pick from. You have Lobo, Shaola, Nitro, Dox, Kringle, and Lou, each that have their own stage. Ooh. There is a solo mode where you play through, I don't really want to call it a story, but basically because Lobo is a bounty hunter, you only play as him, and it tells you how much money you will earn if you can defeat that character. There is also a versus mode that you can play at either 2-player in just a regular battle, or set up a tournament with multiple players. There's a practice mode so you can figure out what moves do what, but you know what? The controls aren't great, so I don't know if that's going to even help you at all. It does support the 6-button controller for the Sega Genesis, but if you only have a 3-button, for whatever reason, it's the typical Street Fighter controls where you have 3 punches and 3 kicks, so you have to press the start button to switch between the two. While you do have 3 different punches and 3 different kicks, that's pretty much all you're ever going to see as you mash the buttons and try to just land some hits. There aren't really any combos to speak of, and the special moves are very inconsistent and difficult to pull off. Graphics consist of pre-rendered sprites for the characters and backgrounds that are created using what they claim to be silicon graphics, but I felt like it was maybe rendered on a Commodore 64. It was Ocean after all. Sorry, I don't mean to be so snarky. I try to keep things a bit more positive on this channel, but the game definitely deserved to get canceled. There were some reviews that got out there, and none of them were kind either. I also feel like there's a huge contrast between the quality of the 2 versions. While Super Nintendo was always known to get the better looking versions of games, this is a drastic difference. And as bad as the Super Nintendo game looks, it is just that much worse on Sega Genesis. Unfortunately, Lobo's string of bad luck continued, as in 2003, Kemco USA attempted to try to make more of a beat-em-up type game for Lobo on the PS2 and Xbox, and that game was also canceled. In better news, he did eventually make his way into a game in the form of being a playable character in Injustice: Gods Among Us, and he also appears as playable characters in Lego Batman 3, Lego DC Supervillains, and Justice League Cosmic Chaos. As we continue to travel through time, we're going to jump forward another 4 years to the year 2000, the dawn of a new millennium, for Superman: The New Adventures on the Sony PlayStation. If someone were to ask you what this game was based on, I think it'd be pretty simple that it's based on Superman, but more specifically, it's Superman the Animated Series, and it was being developed between 1998 and 2000. Initially intended to be published by Titus Interactive, who had the Superman license at the time, they were a company that was founded in Paris, France in 1985 and lasted until 2004. They published many games, but some of the notable ones for me anyway were Ninja Warriors and Wild Guns on the Super Nintendo, Superman on Game Boy in 1997, and yes, in 1999, Superman on the Nintendo 64. That's gonna come up again, I'm sorry. Titus decided to tap Blue Sky Software to be the developer to make Superman on PlayStation 1. Blue Sky was famous for making Ninja Golf on Atari 7800, Joe Montana 2 Sports Talk Football, and NFL Sports Talk Football 93 starring Joe Montana on the Sega Genesis, as well as other Genesis classics Jurassic Park, Shadowrun, Vector Man 1 and 2, and sadly the not-so-classic Spider-Man Web of Fire on the 32X. So if you go back all of 30 seconds ago, I mentioned Superman for Nintendo 64. Titus did have the license to make Superman games at the time, and they initially intended this game to be a port of that Nintendo 64 game. But due to development issues behind the scenes when making Superman 64 between Titus and DC, Blue Sky just decided, you know what, we'd rather just start from scratch. On top of that, according to PlayStation Museum, the game was actually rebooted around 1999, apparently due to the Columbine shooting. They were quoted as saying, after about a year of development, Superman was again redesigned. In April of 1999, the Columbine shooting happened, and was a big blow to the industry as the media were using video games as a contributing factor for the shootings. Scuttlebutt has it that Titus suddenly changed the game from fighting Lex Luthor's henchmen to fighting robots. Supposedly, the developer was not allowed to have shootings of human beings anymore or realistic-looking weapons in the game. This changed a lot of what the gameplay was going to be into a more switch-pulling, puzzle-based game, which was very different from the animated show and the Nintendo 64 version. PlayStation 1's Superman game was supposed to be released June of 2000, but Titus had let the license expire. They were hoping that they could show off an impressive finished game and get that license back, but they didn't and ultimately had to cancel it. Full disclosure, I haven't really played Superman 64, so I can't really compare it, but I feel like that this game has to be better than that. Instead of just flying around rings, even though you are just pulling levers and solving puzzles, I was having some fun while I was playing it. Controls can be a little bit tricky and they are not customizable, but you basically can fly around, you can punch the enemies, and you have your different abilities that you can use, like your freeze breath, as well as your heat vision. An example of a puzzle will be the fact that you might have a generator that's blocking the door to be able to let you go further, and you have to freeze it until it explodes. Or maybe you have a door that's super hot that needs to be cooled down before you can punch it and shatter it. There are also elements of saving civilians and being able to transport items, but for whatever reason, Superman can only hold one item at a time, so you have to kind of go back and forth to do it, which is kind of strange, but I kind of get what they were going for. All this at the same time as you have robots that are shooting you with, I guess, is kryptonite, or maybe having fields of kryptonite that are bouncing around the level. And if you get hit by it, not only do you take damage, but it also temporarily disables any of your other powers. While the checkpoints are a bit further away than I'd like for them to be, that is part of the challenge of playing the game, and is something that can also be fixed by using something like Save State. The graphics do a nice job of recreating the look and feel of the Superman animated series of the time, at least as best as you can expect with the PlayStation 1 hardware. While it definitely did a better job recreating it on the PS2 game, you can only work with what you got at the time. The music and sound effects all do a great job of helping set the mood, and it definitely feels like you're playing an episode of the cartoon at times. In the end, Superman definitely feels like a game that was further along in development and really was only canceled due to losing a license instead of being of poor quality like some of the games that have been mentioned before on this list. And with that brings us to our last game. We're now jumping to about 2004-ish, and this is a game that I actually was personally looking forward to. All the previous games mentioned on this list were games I didn't even know were coming, so I didn't miss them when they didn't come out. But this one, Daredevil, The Man Without Fear, was one that I was actually bummed when I heard it was canceled. Originally known just as Daredevil the video game during development, it was supposed to be a third-person action beat-em-up similar to the Spider-Man games that were out at the time. It was being developed for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and PC, and is now available online thanks to the video game preservation site Hidden Palace. Developed by 5000 Foot Studios, they previously had worked on the games Army Men World War Team Assault and Army Men Green Rogue, both in 2001 for the PlayStation 1, as well as Stacked with Daniel Negruno for Windows, PS2, Xbox, and PSP in 2006. And those three games aren't just a select few games just to give you an idea of who they were. That's literally the only games that they made. So who would hire such an inexperienced team to make such a lucrative licensed game? That would be Encore Incorporated. Founded in 1994, mostly bundling previously released software, in 1998 they started making original games and worked mostly in the educational games market. While they did try to get this Daredevil game out on the PS2, Xbox, and PC, it did end up getting canceled, and in February of 2003 they released, along with the help of THQ, a Daredevil game on the Game Boy Advance, but this one being developed by Kryptonite Games. According to Hidden Palace, who had to actually do some work on the prototype to get it playable, they said that the game was going to feature an original story based on the Elektra Lives Again graphic novel. The game was allegedly nearly complete, but Marvel refused to approve it. Reportedly, Sony asked for a number of changes that were then made by the developer, but Marvel themselves didn't like them. It was in development for 2 years until at least March of 2004, but ultimately canceled. Earlier I mentioned that they were going for kind of a Spider-Man type game, and you can see in this footage how that's so. The combat is very similar, as well as being able to swing around on a line, and instead of using a Spidey sense, you have Daredevil's sonar view. While we are going a few generations back, I do feel like the graphics could have been a bit better, but at the same time, by keeping things simple, it allows for the game to run much smoother. The music heard in this playable prototype is of the high-energy electronic techno variety, and it wasn't really my thing, but definitely fit the time period that this game would have come out. With that said, there are actually some mentions of some licensed music in the menus, but if you try to click on anything to play them, it just plays the opening Marvel logo again instead. This playable prototype that is out there gives you a really good idea of what they were going for, what could have been, and it made me that much more sad that the game never came out. Yes, it wasn't perfect, there are some problems, but I do also know that it was in an early state. Yes, it was a late prototype and they had to do some work to get it playable, but just like anything, you put a little bit more polish, and I feel like I could have had a lot of fun playing this back in the day. I recently did a video on Ghost Rider and had fun with that game despite all its flaws on PS2, and I feel like this would have been the same case. So there's the list in chronological order of 5 games based on comic books that never got released, or at least in the case of Prime, not released on the original platform it was intended for. While we definitely had some duds, as we got further along on the timeline, I felt like things improved. It's not always a bad thing that something is going to be licensed. Were these any games that you were looking forward to as a kid? And what did you think about being able to play them later on as you got older? Is there anything new that piques your interest that you feel like you're going to try? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, let us know of any other unreleased games based on comic books that you know. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. Until next time, enjoy gaming.